It's late autumn on the frontier. The nights are already freezing, and every day of delay costs warmth. You've got no nails, no blueprints, only raw timber and an axe. The question is simple. Can you turn trees into a shelter that won't collapse under snow? Or drain the heat from your fire? Settlers had to, and the methods they used shaped survival itself. Log construction traditions from Scandinavia, first brought to North America in the 1600s, became the backbone of these cabins. By the end, you'll see why their survival often depended on precision, and one bitterly cold night was often proof enough. The frozen clock began ticking the moment settlers stepped onto new ground. A cabin wasn't simply four walls. It was the only barrier between human breath and a world that froze without mercy. When the wind screamed across the plains and snow pressed down on the fields, even the brightest fire could fade to ash before morning if walls leaked warmth. Every crack in the wood, every gap at the floor decided whether a family woke to a shelter or to frost closing in. Now picture a family arriving late in autumn, wagons still heavy with tools and seeds, yet the first flakes already settling at their feet. Within days, the open land turned to white. There was no chance for neat frames or milled lumber. They had to throw up a shelter fast. Often that meant a hut of poles and soil or a lean-to patched with bark. For a first storm, it would do little. Flames fought against the chill, but heat rushed out through every joint, while smoke whirled back inside. Nights stretched on colder inside the flimsy walls than in the open air, and the danger extended beyond comfort. Poor cabins meant damp floors where food spoiled, children caught fevers, and livestock frozen in pens. But those surfaces absorbed water, and freezing nights pushed moisture into the lowest logs. The cycle of thaw and freeze turned timbers soft, bending walls and filling houses with cold, wet air that bred sickness. A home that looked sturdy under the sun could become an icebox as soon as dark arrived. This struggle for warmth wasn't unique to America. Norwegians, Finns, and Swedes had faced similar winds for centuries, and their notching and stacking traditions traveled with them across the Atlantic. On the frontier, settlers without that background had to stumble through trial and error, only later realizing that building a log cabin was less about muscle and more about precision, borrowed from old world methods. But the race wasn't just against the wind, it was against time. Forests stretched in every direction, yet cutting, trimming, and stacking logs consumed precious hours. Each swing of the axe traded progress on walls for the firewood that would fuel the hearth. If walls didn't rise quickly enough, the freeze would bury the effort before it stood. That's why the foundation became the first battle, long before the roof. It may seem like only a base to hold weight, but early mistakes sealed a family's fate. Laying timbers flat on wet ground meant rot rising invisibly from below. Moisture ate the bottom logs until they warped and sank, dragging roofs and walls down with them. Settlers learned to rule hard and fast. They raised the sill logs on stones or short foundation walls so wood wouldn't sit on wet earth and rot. This simple lift allowed air to move beneath the floor and gave any cabin a fighting chance to see spring. Even with stone beneath, the ground itself remained a constant adversary. Frost drove upward, cracking soil and straining beams. Any weakness split open wider in winter storms. With their homes balanced on stone, settlers turned to the next struggle: thick enough walls to blunt the wind, tight enough joinery to hold in every scrap of heat. And here, the clock wound tighter still. Raising walls meant cutting the right trees, shaping them with an axe, and fitting them together with corners locked strong. Each move demanded more than brute force. It demanded choices about which trees to fell, how high to stack, and how precise each cut needed to be. Those choices began the moment they looked up at the forest around them. Rows of pines and oaks stood like giants, towering and unyielding, waiting to test every swing of the blade. The real battle started long before steel touched bark. By choosing which trees would shape the walls of a cabin, pioneers had learned quickly that the wrong tree spelled wasted labor and weakness in the walls. The best timber was straight, with minimal taper, few knots, and solid grain, giving long, even logs that stacked tight without gaps. Just as important was timing. Trees taken in late fall or winter carried less sap, seasoned better, and drew fewer insects. Settlers who cut in warm months often paid later when warped walls twisted open and pests hollowed out the timbers. When a tree was chosen, the work of felling began. Pioneers followed a clear sequence. First, the front notch, or wedge removed from the side facing the intended fall. Then came the back cut on the opposite side, set slightly higher, releasing the trunk's weight toward the gap. Wooden wedges, driven in with the back cut, acted as guides, keeping the fall predictable and safer for anyone nearby. Chips flew, resin burned in the air, and when the trunk cracked and leaned, the forest gave way with a sound like thunder. For one man with just an axe, broadaxe, adze, or draw knife at hand, it was measured skill more than strength that brought a giant down. Yet felling was only the start. Stripping bark was essential. Draw knives and axes shaved logs bare so moisture couldn't cling and rot the surface. Once cleaned, each trunk needed time to season. Settlers raised them on skids or stones above the ground, stacking with deliberate gaps so air could move between layers. Weeks stretched into months as moisture escaped, shrinking and tightening the wood so that when walls rose, they held form. Manuals like the USDA's Building with Logs later confirmed what practice had taught. Skidding logs above ground could determine whether a cabin outlasted its first winter. Size mattered as well. Builders aimed for logs with top diameters between 10 and 12 inches, a range strong enough for support, but manageable to work with hand tools. Thicker timbers formed the lower courses, where they could bear the weight of walls and roof. Straighter, more uniform pieces were often placed at the front or visible walls, where appearance worked alongside strength. This careful grading of logs, from bottom sills to the highest rows, kept cabins level and balanced. Nothing was left to chance. Each log held an assigned role before the first wall stood. These practices weren't discovered in isolation. Finnish and Swedish immigrants carried older traditions honed in northern climates where woodworking meant survival. They cut winter timber, raised it off wet ground, and practiced seasoning to prevent rot. Their knowledge spread into American settlements, teaching neighbors why wood behaved the way it did and how to counter it. While not every family shared this heritage, entire communities gained when those practices were adopted, blending frontier need with techniques tested across generations. From the outside, a finished cabin gave away little of this hidden planning. A smooth wall of joined logs masked weeks of seasoning, the care in choosing diameters, the strategy in stacking thicker logs low, but the difference emerged in deep winter. A poorly chosen log cracked open, pulling gaps wide and letting in icy drafts. Moisture trapped under bark swelled, splitting fibers until joints opened like wounds. In sound cabins, however, logs locked tight with time, shrinking into stronger fits as seasons passed. The axe may have been the settler's first defense, but it alone wasn't enough. Each strike, each selected trunk, and each stacked row marked a calculation of survival. By taming raw wood into seasoned, stable walls, builders bought their families time against the freeze. But once the piles of logs waited at hand, another challenge rose, deciding how to join them. With weight pressing down and snow ready to exploit the smallest crack, the question was no longer which trees to cut, but how to lock those timbers together, so neither wind nor weather could tear them apart. Corners became the real test of a cabin's strength. Every load from the roof, every shove of the wind, and even the slow weight of daily life bore down here. They weren't just points where walls met, they were the anchors of survival. If a corner joint slipped or opened, the weather won, no matter how carefully the logs had been cut. Settlers knew better than to rely on hardware. Metal fasteners were often scarce and not favored because properly notched joints held better and allowed the logs to settle naturally. Strength came from the way timbers locked together, their weight doing what nails never could. Each notch was more than carpentry. It was an engineered response to snow, wind, and swelling wood. Among the common methods, the saddle or round notch stood out. By carving a curved hollow into the underside of a log, builders made it sit snugly across the timber beneath. As the logs dried and shrank, the notch cinched tighter, sealing against weather instead of gapping. Water drained away at the curve instead of pooling, which slowed rot and made walls last longer in wet winters. It was forgiving, reliable, and the choice of many who valued durability over speed. The dovetail notch worked differently. Angled cuts flared wider on the outside, locking logs against twisting. They shed rain well and made corners highly resistant to shifting. But this method demanded sharp tools, steady skill, and plenty of time. A perfect dovetail wedged as tightly as stonework, but one bad angle left a permanent gap. Few settlers attempted it without prior training, though families with stone-building traditions, like the Scots-Irish, often brought the technique west. Other options leaned on speed rather than perfection. The flat tenon corner, sometimes made by squaring off two sides of a log and overlapping them, went up quickly. It saved labor, but wasn't self-locking. Without pins or pegs to hold things in place, walls could loosen under heavy snow. These cabins often needed constant patching, with families cramming moss or mud into gaps that seemed to open wider each season. Building the joints was a methodical process. A log was laid in place, its position marked carefully. Using dividers or a compass, the builder scribed the exact curve where the upper log met the lower. The hollow was carved with axe or gouge, then tested, trimmed, and tested again. Thin slivers came off until the fit was perfect. This cycle of scribing, shaving, and refitting gave settlers consistency and kept frost from finding its way through hairline gaps. Regional heritage often influenced the choice. Scandinavian immigrants leaned towards saddle notches, tested for centuries in northern forests. Scots-Irish families leaned on dovetailed joints, carrying over ideas from stone walls to timber. Others chose simpler cuts for speed. These choices made cabins as much a record of culture as of necessity. The payoff came in the first storm. Snow piled heavy on the roof, and the joints compressed tighter, holding together through the freeze. Corners that held gave confidence for years. Corners that failed turned into a fight fought daily. constant patchwork instead of strong walls. And yet, even when the corners stood solid and true, settlers weren't safe from the relentless cold. The walls themselves, stacked log over log, still held narrow seams where the wind could creep through. The roof's job was simple: get the snow off before it became a weight problem. Settlers understood that a cabin could survive tight joints and sealed walls, but without a sound roof, none of it mattered. Snow didn't just fall. It stacked, pressed, and pushed until the structure beneath answered with groans and sagging beams. A poor roof leaked and buckled. A good roof shed the storm before it claimed control. Roof construction started with structure. Where milled lumber was scarce, families built purlin roofs, horizontal logs notched firmly into the gable walls. These held the load and gave enough span to support covering material. Where boards or lumber could be cut or traded, rafter roofs offered more triangular framing, easier to cover, but dependent on uniform wood. Both systems were practical responses to what the land allowed, and the lesson was consistent. The skeleton had to spread weight across every log, not concentrate it until failure. Coverings came next, and bark was often the first solution. Peeled in long sheets and dragged onto the roof, bark layered quickly and bought time. But winter tested it harshly. Frost cracked the layers, water seeped underneath, and bark peeled away with thaw. As soon as tools and labor allowed, settlers shifted to something stronger: hand-split shakes. These shingles, split with a froe from straight-grained cedar or pine, resisted splitting across the grain and shed water far better. Ranging 30 to 36 inches long and at least half an inch thick, a roof covered with them could stand years of storms. Bark was temporary, shakes were survival. The way shakes were laid mattered as much as the shakes themselves. A rule of thumb guided the work. Every course overlapped the one beneath by at least 6 inches, and the butts, the lower edges, were staggered so water and snow couldn't find straight seams. Laid onto purlins in thick mats, they formed a rugged but effective skin, one designed to make water run off rather than in. At the ridge, where two sides met, builders sealed with overlapping treatments like the Boston Ridge. This simple method locked rain and snow out where the roof was most vulnerable, proving better than cruder pole or metal caps that leaked under pressure. Pitch made the greatest difference. Settlers from snow-heavy regions of northern Europe already knew shallow roofs invited disaster. They built with steep angles, forcing snow to slide clear instead of pile up. This wasn't decoration. It was calculated survival. The steeper the pitch, the safer the cabin stood when storms dragged on and snow rose by the foot. Those who tried shallow designs learned quickly. Flattened purlins, sagging ridges, and leaking joints followed as soon as the drifts built high. Even details at the edges played into the long game. Projecting eaves directed meltwater away from the walls, keeping water from soaking logs where it could freeze, split, or rot them. Some cabins added an extra purlin at the overhang for strength, bracing the shakes against snow that slid downward in sheets. Without this care, logs beneath the eaves grew soft. Frost widened cracks, and walls that once stood firm began failing from the bottom up. The entire process was labor, but also judgment. Each strike of the froe, each course of staggered shingles, each notch at the eave cost precious time. Settlers balanced that cost against the threat above their heads. A strong roof earned nights of unbroken rest inside. A weak one meant repairs by moonlight, or worse, collapse while snow still fell. When roofs rose correctly, cabins finally became more than shelters. They became secure homes, holding warmth steady behind their sealed walls. But survival wasn't finished once the snow slid harmlessly from the roof. Protection from above meant little without life inside, and each family's final defense still burned at a single point: the hearth. Life on the frontier demanded more than endurance. It demanded calculation. A cabin's survival came down to 3 essentials: a solid foundation raised off wet ground, straight and well-seasoned logs locked with reliable corner notches, and walls sealed with moss or mud beneath a steep roof strong enough to shed snow. Each of these steps was deliberate craftsmanship, not chance, and together they turned raw timber into lasting shelter. These cabins remain proof of ingenuity shaped by necessity, drawing on techniques carried from Europe and refined in America. Tell us which frontier trick surprised you most in the comments. If this kind of frontier engineering interests you, like and subscribe. More deep dives on Old West craftsmanship are coming.